Hello, everybody. My name is Stephen McCracken, and you're all very welcome tonight to Trasnatira. This is our very last Zoom meeting in this current series, and probably September will open back up again. So just remember at Trasnatira, I'd like to thank all the hosts: Liam Sardal, Colm Rock, Mary Maffer, Marcus Howard, and most of all, Liam O'Sullivan. So I'm going to hand you over to Mark Dougherty, who's going to introduce our next speaker. Thank you very much for tuning in now.
Thank you, Stephen, and good evening, everyone, and welcome, or maybe good afternoon if you're in America. I'm impressed there are people attending this from beyond the shores of Ireland, the other side of the Atlantic, so you're very, very welcome. So before I introduce our speaker for this evening, on the same subject as the talk, I'd like to bring to your attention that this weekend that a group of cultural organisations are running an event called Harps Alive in Belfast. So there's events on Friday, Saturday and Sunday. I'm taking many forms, talks, workshops, and of course concerts, all relating to the harp. So if you're interested in that, and I would encourage you to, if you can get to Belfast, the website is simply harpsalive.com. So I'd advise you to check that out, and there's something in there for everyone who's got any sort of fascination with the harp and the older music of Ireland. Also take note that the weekend after that, then Sunday the 24th of July, there is a talk and a visit to the grave of Edward Bunting as well, who of course is famous for recording the ancient music of Ireland from the Harpers. But enough on that. I'll now introduce Fiona Pegrum, our presenter for tonight. Fiona is a qualified genealogist, so she's quite an expert in that field and very appropriate person to tell us more about Dennis Hempson, the last of the ancient harpers. If you have any questions during the talk, if you could put them up in the chat box, and there will also be an opportunity afterwards if you prefer to ask them in person. So over to you, Fiona. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Let me just sort myself out here. And you're all very welcome. And already I'm pushing forward. So, good evening, everyone. And tonight's talk is on Dennis Hempson, the last of the ancient Irish harpers, whose method of playing and his tunes was noted down in detail by Edward Bunting. Dennis died in 1807, and he's buried in McGilligan. And this talk will focus on the details given on his life, recorded in 1805 by the Church of Ireland minister, George Vaughan Sampson. Now, Arthur Young, an English agriculturist, writer, traveller, and friend of Frederick Hervey, the Bishop of Derry, visited Ireland from 1776 until 1779. In July of 76, he passed through Belfast, which he considered a very well built town of brick with broad and straight streets, which were lively and busy with the 15,000 inhabitants. He did note that the public buildings are not very numerous nor very striking, but Lord Donegal is building an assembly room, 60 feet long by 30 broad and 24 high, a very elegant room. A card room adjoining, 30 by 22 and 22 high, and a tea room of the same size. In July 1792, these assembly rooms would be the venue for the first Belfast Harp Festival. 11 harpers, many blind, attended, where they played their best airs in the presence of a distinguished audience and received money prizes apportioned to their respective degree of skill. And these ranged from 10 to 2 guineas. 19-year-old Edward Bunting had been employed to note down the tunes. The harpers were in general clad in a comfortable, homely manner in drab coloured or grey cloth of coarse manufacture. A few of them made an attempt at splendour by wearing silver buttons on their coats, particularly O'Higgins and O'Neill. The former had his buttons decorated with his initials only, but O'Neill had his initials surmounted by the crest of the O'Neills engraved on buttons the size of half a crown. Some had horses and guides when travelling through the county, others their attendants only, who carried their harps. They seemed perfectly happy and contented with their lot, and all appeared convinced of the excellence of the genuine old Irish music, which they said had existed for centuries and, from its delightful melody, would continue to exist for centuries to come. Among this group was a blind man in his 90s who called himself Dennis Hempson. He had travelled from McGilligan on the north coast in the county of Londonderry. He played with long, crooked fingernails, and in his performance, the tinkling of the small wires and the deep notes of the bass caught the attention of Bunting. From the music he had heard, Bunting commenced his first collection of sheet music, which appeared in 1796 and contained 66 Irish airs never before published. He continued gathering together the old national music and travelled Ireland to find it, and in 1809 published his second volume, consisting of 75 additional tunes with a dissertation on the Irish harp. In preparing his second volume, he frequently visited Hempson, the last harper who played the ancient Aboriginal music of the country, and from him acquired a knowledge of the terms of musical science. It is not known when Bunting's last visit to McGilligan was. He was there in 1804. Hempson died in 1807. In 1805, the author Sidney Owenson sent a request to a local minister to visit Dennis. She would also visit the harper a couple of weeks after this visit. Sidney had been born in Dublin to an Irish Catholic father who was an actor, and her mother an English Protestant. Her mother had died when she was young, and her father sent his two daughters off for a private education. Due to financial pressures, she had then worked as a governess before becoming an author. Described as an Anglo-Irish liberal, Sidney, who became Lady Morgan in 1812, was a leading figure in the Irish cultural revival. Her most influential novel, The Wild Irish Girl, A National Tale, 1806, romanticised the Irish landscape and aspects of Gaelic culture while criticising Irish peasant barbarity. Sidney had asked the Reverend George Vaughan Sampson to visit Dennis and ask him questions. Sampson did this on the 2nd of July, 1805, responding by a letter written the following day, forwarding it on to her by his good friend, Dr. Patterson of Derry. The following year, the novel The Wild Irish Girl was published and included a transcript of Sampson's letter. This letter was also later published in Edward Bunting's 1840 book, but with slight amendments made. Sampson's letter is 1,740 words long and is an authentic record of details which would otherwise have been lost. Topics covered included Dennis's place of birth, the name of his father and the townlands in McGilligan associated with his parents, Dennis's loss of eyesight and his first harp teachers and masters, his first position as a harper and of his first harp, his life as a travelling harper, his recollections of Sampson and his family, and Dennis's life in McGilligan, his family and house. Dennis was born in the townland of Craigmore near Garver. This is next to Cam Forest in the civil parish of Agadui in the barony of Coleraine. This area was part of the Ulster plantation and settled from 1609 by the London Guild of Ironmongers. Their chief tenant and agent was a City of London merchant called George Canning. He held the Craigmore townland. His grandson George Canning succeeded him and died at Garver in 1711, and he was then succeeded by his only son, Stratford Canning, who was born in 1803. McGilligan in the parish of Tamletard was churchland. A survey taken in 1607 by the first Protestant Bishop of Derry, George Montgomery, details the parish as it was. In 1609, it was declared to belong to the Anglican bishop, and the churches were taken from the priests and given to the new Church of Ireland and its congregation of planters. In McGilligan, the entire church lands belonged to the Anglican Bishop of Derry, except for one townland. The McGilligans, the former set head of Tamletard, were left with Ballycarton. This they lost in the 1641 rebellion. Dennis says his father was called Brian Daraher Hempson, and that he held the whole townland of Tacreven, which currently has just over 400 acres to it. This townland is on the slopes of the Benevena mountain, and if anyone has walked the Tacreven road up to Bishop's Road, you will understand what a challenge it would have been to have lived up there. Reviewing the limited records that there are for this period shows that in 1659, John Major was the main leaseholder to the bishop of this townland. There are 11 residents on this townland, all of whom were Irish, but their names are not noted. In the subsidies rolls of 1662, a Brian O'Hampson is entered. Subsidies were grants made to the king based on the valuation of goods and land. Therefore, it is only the wealthier people who will be listed. O'Hampsons and later Hampsons are noted occasionally in the few remaining records, with the last, a Darby Hampson of Cluny Townland, recording a will in 1755. Dennis states that his mother's relations were in possession of Woodtown, which Sampson notes is also a considerable farm. This townland is found across the road from the entrance to Benone Tourist Complex and consists of a little over 188 acres today. The wording that is used in Sampson's letter is interesting. We do not know Dennis's mum's first name or surname, and the term relatives is vague enough to not be able to conclude that it was her immediate family members that were farming here. It is presumed that Dennis and his family continued living at Garva. At the age of 3, he lost his eyesight to smallpox, a contagious, disfiguring, and often deadly disease. Blindness would now limit his ability to work, but a common path to those so afflicted was as a musician. At the age of 12, he began to learn the harp under Bridget O'Cahan, followed by John Gallagher, Lachlan Fanning, and Patrick Connor. He mentions that John was a blind travelling harper, and then he went with him to Buncrana. Whether the other harpers were tied to a large house or also travelled is not known. At 18 years of age, Dennis began to play for himself and was taken into the house of Councillor Canning at Garva for half a year. His host, with Squire Gage and Dr. Bacon, bought him a harp. This harp had the following lines sculptured on it, and according to Sampson, was made from white sally at the front and sides. The back was of fir, and it was patched with copper and iron plates. A modern reconstruction of Dennis' harp has identified that it was actually made of alder rather than the native willow and fir that Sampson supposes. The replica was played at the Harps Live event held on the 9th of July, and this is the picture of it being played at the Tamletard Church. So who were Councillor Canning, Squire Gage, and Dr. Bacon? The Canning family we have already encountered as the original agents to the Ironmongers Company. Stratford Canning, who was born in 1703, had succeeded his father who died in 1711. The Gage family were of McGilligan, having originally come from Northamptonshire in England. William Gage was responsible for the tradesmen brought over for the Ulster plantation. His brother was Reverend Robert George, born in 1659 in Northamptonshire, who had become a Church of Ireland minister and was from 1691 the rector of Achadui until his death in 1725. Dr. Bacon received his Doctor of Divinity in 1740. His name was Reverend Benjamin Bacon, and he was born at Ballymaclary in Magilligan in a family with English origins. He was the second son of Robert Bacon, who had died in 1746, and Hester Howard, who died in 1750. He had married twice. The first wife was Elizabeth Gage, the daughter of Reverend Robert Gage, mentioned above. He was Archdeacon of Derry. He died on the 2nd of May, 1772, and is buried in the old Tamletard church with his parents and son. Dennis says he was travelling 9 or 10 years throughout Scotland, and he mentions various people, particularly Scottish ones. He also comments that he only met one laird who had a harp, which was a small one, but that Hempson had tuned it with new strings, and having heard him play, they'd invited him back to teach their 3-year-old son when he was older. Dennis never accomplished this. He was in Scotland twice, and on the second occasion, in 1745, had been invited by Colonel Kelly of Roscommon and Sir Thomas Sheridan, the Jacobite tutor of Charles Edward Stuart, to play and sing for the king. He tells Sampson that he was called into the great hall to play. At first he was alone. Afterwards 4 fiddlers joined. The tune called for was "The King Shall Enjoy His Own Again," and he proceeded to sing to Sampson. Dennis played in many Irish houses and in the great towns. He mentions the Belfast Harp Festival and the tunes he played, which include the Dawning of the Day, under the patronage of some amateurs of Irish music. Edward Bunting, his name noted as Bunton by Sampson, had been to visit Dennis in the previous year. Dennis passes a comment that when he played the old tunes, not another of the harpers would play after him. Dennis already knew Reverend Sampson and his family. When he had travelled to Buncrana with his master, John Garaher, it was to play for Colonel George Vaughan, who was the great-grandfather of Reverend Sampson, and it's where he got his middle name Vaughan from. Dennis tells Sampson of many stories about his grandfather and his great-aunt, whose houses Dennis used to be at frequently. Dennis also recalls Sampson at a young age, and George is surprised at the memory of a man aged 108. Sampson has brought his children with him, and Dennis, with tones of great affection, blessed God that he had seen 4 generations of the same name, and ended by giving the children his blessing. So George Vaughan Sampson was born in April 1762 to Reverend Arthur Sampson and Mary, daughter of George Spate, Esquire of Carrickfergus. He was the eldest son. The family were of English origin. He was not only a highly finished classical scholar, but also versed in Hebrew, French, Italian, and Irish. He also distinguished as a chemist, a mineralogist, and a botanist. Sampson advocated a number of things that he saw created poverty in Ireland, including the ending of landlord absenteeism, a stop to excessive farm division, reduction of rents to a reasonable level, the establishment of nurseries for forest trees, planting of boglands for forestation, programs of drainage, a program of building of farmhouses to suitable standards, improvement of all roads, bridges, and other infrastructure, and the establishment of model schools in decent buildings. His radical continental inspired ideas may have been influenced by his brother William, a United Irishman, writer, and lawyer, who was exiled from 1799 and eventually deported to America. William Sampson had been a friend to Theobald Wolfetone, became a leading figure at the American bar, and eventually took on, as a legal trainee, Wolfetone's son, William Theobald Tone. William Theobald Tone married William Sampson's daughter, Catherine Anne, in 1825. George and William's other brother, Michael, was a lawyer, and he also settled in America at Sampson Hall. George Fawn Sampson, who does not appear to have been affected professionally or socially by his brother's activities. In 1827, George Sampson died. His funeral procession from his rectory to his burial place at Annaloo was attended by large numbers of people. There was a great depth of snow at the time, but the people of the country simultaneously turned out and cut a passage for his hearse from Glenullen near Garver to Annaloo, a distance of 12 miles across the mountain. Many hundreds of his parishioners walked in solemn procession to his grave. Dennis had returned to McGilligan many years ago, and at the age of 86 had married a lame woman from Inishowen, whom he'd found living in a house of a friend. Why he had returned to McGilligan is not known, but is explained by several writers as the Irish Catholics as not only being tied to the country, but almost to the parish in which their ancestors lived. Lord Bristol, while lodging at the bathing house of Mount Sellew near McGilligan, gave 3 guineas and ground rent-free to build the house where Hempson now lives. At the housewarming, his lordship with his lady and family came, and the children danced to his harp. The bishop gave 3 crowns to the family, and in the dear year, his lordship called in his coach and 6, stopped at the door, and gave a guinea to buy meal. Dennis refers to Lord Bristol, which was a social title for the Frederick Hervey, the Bishop of Derry, and as from 1779, the Earl of Bristol. He was also a lord through his maternal line. Frederick had become bishop in 1768 and lived in the Bishop's Palace in Derry. He built a mansion at Downhill in 1776. He was not in Ireland very much and spent a great deal of time abroad purchasing treasures for the Downhill domain, a mansion of which the ruins remain today. The bathing house Mount Sellew was formerly the resort of fashionable invalids. It was built by subscription under the patronage of Miss Tompkins, a beauty of last century. The intention was to combine sea bathing and Goat's Way with cheerful society. In March 1775, a newspaper advertisement by John Cust of McGilligan advertised that his way house had the Bishop of Derry and his family as guests. It was a large house built in the townland of Craig. Today, this townland is where the old McGilligan station house is built, and it rises up towards the mountain. A guinea, a coin paid to artists, a tradesman would be paid in pounds, was worth £1 and 1 shilling. The house would be made of materials that were available in the locality. In McGilligan, the houses built in the flat boggy lowlands would be built of sod, while those higher up in the mountainous area of stone. Marram grass, known as bent, grew in the extensive rabbit warrens that made up a substantial part of the coastal area, and that would be used for thatching the roof. The bishop came with his family to the housewarming, and his children danced as Dennis played. The Earl Bishop further supported Dennis and his family by giving him a guinea to buy meal in the dear year. The land on which the house stood was rent-free and in the corner of a field in the townland of Ballymaclary. One account says it's opposite the present Anglers Rest pub. Another says it is opposite this pub, but on the seaside. There is no evidence of it now. The times that Frederick Hervey was in Ireland have been documented by his biographers, and using this information, we can calculate roughly when Dennis built a house in McGilligan. The bishop was in Ireland between 1772 and 1776. The advertisement is for 1775, but the bishop may have gone to Mount Sellew a number of times that were not recorded. We can therefore give this 4-year period as a time for when Dennis settled in McGilligan. The dear year that Dennis refers to is possibly the subsistence crisis of 1782 to 1784. There were many famines in Ireland which resulted in a high mortality rate, but the subsistence issues created incredibly high food prices. The bishop was at Downhill in 1783. He left Ireland in 1791, never to return, and his cousin, Reverend Henry Hervey Bruce, managed the estate before inheriting it on the Earl Bishop's death in 1804. Sampson goes to visit Dennis and says he found him lying on his back in bed near the fire of his cabin. His family employed in the usual way his harp under the bedclothes, by which his face was covered also. When he heard my name, he started up, being already dressed, and seemed rejoiced to hear the sound of my voice, which, he said, he began to recollect. He then tuned his old-time beaten harp, his solace and bedfellow, and played with astonishing justness and good taste. On the 5th of November, 1807, Dennis Hempson died. It was reported that he'd been tuning his harp in readiness for the Bruce family to visit. He left one daughter, Catherine, who was married to a cooper and had several children, and was aged about 35 in 1807. In the 1831 census, 2 McKeever families live in the Ballymaclary townland, but they've all left by the 1860s. Dennis was buried up at the old church of Tamletard. The church had been destroyed during the events of the 17th century, and a new church had been built by William Gage in 1680. In the 1770s, the bishop had offered the church to the local Catholic population. It was used as a place of worship until the new Catholic chapel situated adjacent to it was built in 1826. Dennis was buried with a plain headstone. There had been a comment made that Lady Morgan, formerly Sidney Owenson, was going to have a marble slab made for his grave, but this seems to have been a mix-up with the Harper Caroline, who did have a marble memorial stone paid for by Lady Morgan. The old Limavady Borough Council placed a memorial to the Harper. It's placed in front of a small headstone to Mary Hansey. There's 3 issues with Dennis, and the first one's his age. Dennis's age at death is given anywhere from 110 to 150 years of age, and Sampson says that Dennis is 108 when he interviews him in July 1805, which would make him 110 or in his 111th year, depending on his birthday, when he dies in November 1807. Dennis himself does not give a birth year of 1695, but it is one that is recorded on the memorial. Sampson records an age that Dennis considers himself at, which would make his year of birth around 1697. Hempson was performing for Charles Edward Stuart when he was about 50 years old in 1745. Again, with a year of birth of around 1697, Dennis would be aged 48. Dennis also states he was married when he was 86, but his daughter is 33 in 1805, making her year of birth around 1772. It would mean that he married in 1782 or 1783, a good 10 years after her birth. Perhaps he did actually marry in 1772 at the age of 76. It would time with the years that his house was being built. The early records of the area give the name of O'Hampson. Dennis is known as Hempson and Hampson. He was also referred to as the man with 2 heads on account of a large wen on the back of his head. Sampson writes that he had seen him last in 1787, and he had greatly increased, and it was now hanging over his neck and shoulders, nearly as large as his head. In 1824, the local Presbyterian minister, Reverend Samuel Butler, wrote a survey of the McGilligan area, and in it he refers to the Harper. He says that Dennis O'Hampsey was known by the name of the McGilligan Harper, that he was born in Glennulla in this county, and that he was taught the harp by Bridget Kelly, whose harp he possessed and left in Downhill. He says Dennis was personally acquainted with Caroline, having met often at Glenarvan Castle. O'Neill, another harper, had spent some time in McGilligan. He says that Dennis often entertains the neighbours and the stranger, but especially the bathing visitors. By 1846, the spelling Hempsey was appearing in articles about the Harper, and by the turn of the 20th century, O'Hampsey was being used. An article written in 1905 by L.A. Walkington on the request of F.J. Bigger describes a visit to McGilligan to try and find out some information about him. They walk back and forth between Downhill and McGilligan, McGilligan to Ballerina, but can't find anyone who knows anything, although farmers called Con tell him that the Harper was known as O'Hampsey. So what happened to his harp? Sydney Owenson adds a note to her novel, The Wild Irish Girl, dated 1806, that Dennis had been in contact and had offered to sell his harp to her. This did not happen, as the harp was in Sir Reverend Henry Bruce's possession by 1831, and it was noted that it was his son, Sir James Bruce, that had inherited it. It was acquired by Guinness in 1963 and is on display in the Guinness Storehouse Museum. Finally, this is a comment made by Northern Survey memoir taker G. Downs. And he notes that the Harper and the Saint are reposed side by side. He writes, "There remains the last minstrel of McGilligan and of his first saint reposed not inappropriately together. Though belongs to ages separated by more than 1,000 years, they were both connected as end links of a chain with a singular and peculiar framework of society, now wholly broken up, but which has undergone but little change during the long period of time which intervened between them." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fiona, for an excellent talk with lots and lots of interesting details, as expected.
Unexpected or expected?
Oh, expected.
Oh, good, good, yes.
Can I ask a question about the harp itself? Who sold the harp to Guinness? Do you know who possessed it at that time?
Yeah, I understand that the Bruces actually held an auction to get rid of lots of property in their household, and the harp ended up in Dublin in some kind of, shop, and the Guinness, they actually got it from there, from whether there was another auction or, but yes, so it was a bit of a strange one, but it was sold at an auction, or it may not even be an auction. It was sold from the Bruce's house for whatever reason. They were getting rid of everything, probably financials.
Interesting, because of course, being such an historic object, you'd think they'd have some attachment to it. And the history of it's very interesting as well, because his daughter actually claims, I mean, we've just seen there that it says it's from 1702, but his daughter actually claims to the Ordnance Survey in the 1830s that the harp's actually 270 years old, which of course it doesn't actually make sense when we're talking about the 1830s, and it was created in 1702. So I'm not sure there, maybe it's just, she couldn't actually read the little, read the actual poem on it. Yeah. So I think we're getting quite a few questions here. I'm not sure whether I'll be able to answer them, but let's, right. Are there any recordings available of the harp with the, right, this is an interesting one. This is Julie Kane. It was the very same question. I don't think anyone's grown their nails or playing the same way that Dennis did. Is that right, Mark? Yes. There's nobody who's playing exactly as he did, because he played with the high notes with his left hand. The convention in the modern world is to play high notes with your right hand, but certainly there's at least one good, excellent copy of the original downhill harp that is owned by Evan Devlin, and she plays it so that it will have exactly the same sound as the original harp. It's a very faithful replica, made of similar woods, and it is wire strung, and it is tuned in exactly the same way as the original harp. It can be tuned the same because Edward Bunting actually noted the tuning of the harp, so you can hear that, and indeed you may be able to hear it as well at events over this weekend live, at some of the Harps Alive events as well in Belfast.
Okay, any other questions?
Can I ask another one? Are there any descendants of Dennis Hempson out there? Is that possible?
Oh, good question. I would love to say yes, and I know who they are. So he had the one daughter, and her name was Catherine, and she married a McKeever. And we know this because, again, she was interviewed for the Ordnance Survey memoirs. And so we'd like to think there's lots of McKeevers. In the 1831 census, there's actually 2 McKeever families, equating about 9 people. And then they're gone. So I'd like to think there are some McKeevers out there who actually know they tie up with this Catherine, who is the daughter of Dennis, but so far no one has admitted it.
It would be wonderful to find a connection in the modern world. NM Com has put a hand up. Would you like to ask a question of Fiona?
Yes, Mark, it's Neil Comer. How's it going?
Oh, hello, Neil.
How you doing? First of all, Fiona, excellent talk. There's 2 things, suppose just the last thing on the McKeever surname that just come into my head. There are actually a number of McKeevers in the Glenullen area, and it's a name that's extinct, so like it's still there. I suppose it's more of an observation than a question, and it's in terms of a possibility of more sources. And I think we talked about this before. I mean, at the time, the area, was very much Gaelic speaking, certainly bilingual. Amongst the Gaelic, amongst the Irish peasantry, the language was, until I suppose pre-famine, Gaelic speaking, bilingual. And it's very interesting that you mentioned about Sampson having a knowledge of the Gaelic language, and that's probably from a classical point of view. And I'm just wondering, with the new, with the launch a few weeks ago of the archives that had been destroyed in 1922, it could be very, very interesting to see, is there any manuscript documentation written in Irish about the time that may, because I'm sure that the manuscripts of the families, because we do know that they were kept, even though they had fallen from, they had lost their lands, etc., that there was still a very strong manuscript tradition, because I know in the Ordnance Surveys, there's a guy in Glenullen called Brian Mann, that was the family nickname, Mullen, who a lot of stuff was collected from about place names. And he was in the 1830s, was a man in his sort of latter years, 70s, 80s. And this isn't a question, by the way. It's just an observation that the story, hopefully the story hasn't ended and there's more information there, and particularly in the Gaelic language sources. And it's great to know that, we've sources we haven't found yet. That's all. Thanks very much, Fiona. That was a good talk.
Thank you, Neil. Well, actually, there is someone who I haven't mentioned at all. I mentioned there William Sampson, the United Irishman, going off to America, and he's got a memoir book if you ever wanted to read it. But there was a chap called Thomas Cather, who was the son of a man called David Cather. David was actually a Presbyterian, but Thomas, his son, was Church of Ireland, and Thomas had trained to be a barrister, but then didn't actually use it. Instead, he just spent his time being a gentleman farmer and researching the Gaelic language and culture. And so this young Church of Ireland man is fluent again in Irish, and there are pages and pages of the beautiful script. And he actually spent a lot of time looking at townland names, Neil, and actually writing them out and their meanings. And those papers are sat in Prony. I have a copy of, I've copied some of those, and I would be interested to see whether on your research, whether they actually make sense or if there's something new in there. But there is a lot of hidden stuff, and I think once people realise that Church of Ireland ministers were speaking Irish, they were able to understand it, all sorts of people were, hopefully we'll find a lot more in archives and private family documents. Whether we're going to find anything in beyond 2022, I don't know, but you never know. There's certainly a lot hidden out there. We need to keep an eye.
Can I just mention one more point there, that in the late Rory Blaney's, just actually buried last week, his book Presbyterians in the Irish Language, when he talks about, and he has a lecture, actually it's available on YouTube, and he talks about the ministers that were trained to preach in Irish, and he mentions the Coleraine area specifically. So again, I just think that there's a lot there that we can still find, and you know, I would be highly surprised if our erstwhile Hempson doesn't appear somewhere along the lines.
It would be brilliant if he did. It really would. I am just really pleased that we have an 1805 document which we can say was written at the time. Whether some alterations, no, this isn't original, it's a transcription that goes into the book, but it really is authentic. And if it hadn't been done, if Sampson hadn't been requested to come around, then we would have lost most about Hempson. In fact, we really wouldn't know anything apart from the bit that Edward Bunting had put down, but we would certainly not have known any of the stuff. It just wouldn't have existed. You know, Hempson was not the rich, landed, titled person. So like most people, he would have just been forgotten. But hopefully he is in some record somewhere. So everyone keep an eye out.
An intriguing possibility.
Yes, new project for you, Mark.
Oh, here we need a knowledgeable Gaelic scholar on that one.
Oh, who could that be?
That would rule me out. I was fascinated as well to see. I've never realised this before, that a cottage from Duncrun is in the Folk Museum.
Oh, right. Well, this is kind of like common knowledge in McGilligan, and I suppose we're so used to these things that we don't even bother mentioning them. That is, there is a picture. If you go on to the museum site, there is a picture of what it looked like before they took it away and made it look all nice, and it's a real mess. But they've also got the history of the place, and there's a lot of people who descend from those people who are still alive, and a lot of them are still living in McGilligan, and it's absolutely fascinating. But that's the kind of place that Hempson would have been living in, would have been thrown up.
I'm also interested. I'm holding it up here.
Yeah,
on,
that one. I was going to show that one actually, because I felt that was probably more spot on. I like the back bit where, you know, things seem to be growing up, and you know, it's
fantastic.
The back. Yeah.
Yes.
Really.
So that's labelled. It was photographed by William Alexander Green, one of our finest photographers, probably certainly a century ago, around 1920, and it says dwelling near Benevena. So that could be that. It looks similar.
I think Stephen and I actually worked out where that was, but I can't, given that it was a few years ago, pre-COVID, I cannot remember. Can you remember that, Stephen? We worked out where it was on the mountain.
That's on the Limestone Road.
Was it? It's the limestone. Yes, we did. In fact, we worked it out another week.
No,
it's long gone.
Right, and it is, but it does look similar to the one in Cultraw in the Folk Museum.
Yeah, near off the same.
Yeah.
It's intriguing, but I think it's very evocative that you could imagine Hempson living in a cottage like that.
And also you have to look at where the door is. So the door's away from those nasty winds coming off the sea as well. So
those refreshing breezes.
Like McGilligan. So,
yes, and there was a note there about that Sampson was a headmaster at Foyle College.
He was. There was lots of stuff I had to miss out because I could have just given a talk on Sampson and his family, which I found intriguing. He certainly was. He also wrote lots of books. He was the agent for the fishmongers too. A lot of the stuff he put forward, they actually put into plans. So the model farm in Ballykelly, Sampson had suggested everyone had model farms and model schools, and off they went with this further, and actually built this model farm, and it's all down to Sampson. So although Sampson had obviously come from a well-to-do background, he could see the problems with Ireland, and he could see that unless you looked after the people and the land, we were just going to go one way. And there was a lot that he actually predicted and happened, in terms of the farms being too small and people having to emigrate, and etc. So there's plaques.
That's interesting. It does sound like he is a product of more of the Enlightenment era as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think the interesting thing is once you know who his brother is as well, it tells you then what the family were like. But what's really interesting on all these people is we're looking at people who have English origins, which I find fascinating in itself. So no matter how we look at it, each person's got this kind of English background somewhere there. But of course they would have, because they would have been the people who had the land and could, you know, and had the money and could make things happen. So that obviously makes sense, but it is an interesting turn on how some things are viewed in history when you start looking at that kind of thing.
And also it's one of the substantial links between the McGilligan area and the United Irishmen in Belfast. And of course, another very significant one is Edward Bunting living with the McCracken family in Belfast.
Yes, you probably noticed I missed that out as well. I've put a lot in, but I realised that we had covered quite a lot when we did our talk at Mussenden Temple. And because we're going to be talking again on Saturday, I didn't want to ruin it if people are coming to visit. But Mark, I can also tell we've got lots of people from America, so perhaps you'd like to mention the connection to Edward Bunting and the McCrackens.
Yes. Edward Bunting himself, he came to Belfast and he was effectively fostered by Captain McCracken and his wife Anne. So he then joined a family of 6 siblings, and he was closest to John McCracken, who was the same age, and Mary Ann McCracken, who was a couple of years younger. But also he, of course, would have known Henry Joy McCracken very well. He would have known all the family very well and was part of that liberal enlightened circle. But I thought it was very intriguing that actually it was mentioned by David Byers in a lovely new book, which I'll also plug, which isn't quite within reach. He mentioned that Henry Joy McCracken, while in Kilmainham jail in 1797, he wrote very regularly to his family, and particularly to Mary Ann, that he mentioned that John, his brother, and Bunting were going to McGilligan, and he wished that he could be there with them. Which I think it's just a very short comment, but I thought that was quite a remarkable comment, that he was missing going to the McGilligan area. It's quite possible he would have been there with them before. So it's quite possible, due to Bunting's fascination with this ancient harper, that the McCrackens were regular visitors to the McGilligan area.
Possibly going to that Mount Salou for a bit of goat sway and a bit of entertainment.
Absolutely. Sounds great, doesn't it?
Mark, if you don't mind me asking, was Bunting a Mason?
I've no idea. It's quite possible. Certainly Henry Joy McCracken was a Mason, and I assume other siblings. So I don't know the answer to that, but it's certainly an interesting question, because it was something that gentlemen did in those days.
Yeah, and you showed a picture of the green photograph. The wee house. His house is for sale that he lived in Antrim town.
Whose house? Sorry.
The photographer.
Oh right.
Yeah,
he lived in Antrim town.
He lived in Antrim town, yeah. Big fancy house.
Oh, very
so
good.
if you go on Property Pal, you'll find it, and it's got the blue plaque outside it.
Excellent. Oh, I never knew that connection. W.A. Green was one of our finest photographers, along with a few others, particularly Robert Welch and Alexander Hogg. So that's the big 3, and they were phenomenal photographers, taking wonderful, wonderful photographs around Ireland, really. So that was a particularly good one from William Green, one that I treasure myself. So let me see, were there any more questions or points there, Stephen?
Yeah, David Douglas, who'd be tour guide in Derry, has come up just to correct that.
Just to confirm the
His name is in Boyle College up on the big board of past headmasters, under a different name, of course. The school.
And Neil Comer mentioned there as well. Sorry, Fiona, you're about to say.
Yeah, there's a plaque stone in the primary school in Glenallen, which originates. So we've actually got a little nice tour going on here. We can go all over the place with Sampson.
I wonder if that was William Sampson or William Sampson's son. Put that up.
Yeah. William Sampson's son. Well, Thomas Cav, the one I was telling you about, he actually went over to America, and I was there for about 18 months, and his adventures were actually published in, I think, the 1950s, but he actually went and met them all. So he's talking about the United Irishmen, and he goes and meets their descendants, which is absolutely brilliant, really, really good. So there's a lot more to investigate in that one.
It sounds like there'd be a great talk there on George,
Yeah.
William, and was it Michael the third?
Michael, yeah, he was a lawyer as well. So definitely. And as I said, the William does have a memoir. If you look through it, I didn't realize there was another brother. So when I was reading through, I was thinking the brother they were referring to was Reverend Sampson, but in fact I think it was probably Michael, the lawyer, helping him out in all sorts of bother he got himself into. But it's a good book. It's on Internet Archive anyway, if you want to read the memoirs of William Sampson.
Excellent, thank you. And was William Sampson held in Fort George in Scotland?
Yes, yes,
Oh, very much a
absolutely.
ringleader.
Yes. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you. So if there are no more questions, maybe time to finish up, but give me a second. I will also just mention again all of the many diverse range of harp events in Belfast this weekend on www.harpsalive.com, but also I will mention in passing as well a lovely little book produced by David Byers, historian and musician, on gatherings of Irish harpers. That's recommended as well, and that will be available via Harps Alive too. So thank you very much, Fiona, for an excellent talk tonight as expected, and I'm looking forward already to the Sampson talk next year.
Let's get over Saturday first.
Yes, indeed. Yes. Oh, I should mention that between the two of us, we're giving a talk in Dennis Hempson in Rosemary Street Presbyterian Church on Saturday at noon. Oh, isn't it noon? Yes, at noon. Sorry, I'm trying to keep up with myself here. Thanks again, Fiona. Thank you, everyone, for coming along tonight.
Yeah, thank you. It was a late talk tonight, but
Yeah.
good number of people.
Okay, so everybody, there's a lot of well done, Fiona, and thank you very much, Fiona and Mark. So that just leaves me to say night to everybody, and we'll see you again after the summer, hopefully in September. Okay, all the best from Trasnateira and all the hosts, and thank you again to Fiona and Mark. Great lecture.
Thanks, Stephen. All the best.
Thank you.
Fair night.